Welcome to the final evening of Drake Well Museum and Park's virtual lecture series, Talking Back, Women's Voices in the Oil Story. I'm Sue Bates, and I'm the museum's curator and your moderator for this evening. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with us, the museum is located in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and is one of 21 historic sites owned by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and administered by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Drake Well Museum and Park preserves and interprets the site of the Drake Well, chronicling the birth and development of the petroleum industry in Pennsylvania and its growth into a global enterprise. We're very pleased to have you join us this evening, and I would like to thank our event sponsor, the Pennsylvania Independent Oil and Gas Association, as well as our partners, the Friends of Drake Well Incorporated, for helping the museum bring this program to you. Before we jump into our presentation, I'd like to go over a few logistics. Attendees, your cameras will remain off and microphones muted for the duration. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will hold all questions for the Q&A period following the presentation so that Melissa can address and answers to the entire crowd, but feel free to add them to the Q&A as they come to you. Please also feel free to use the chat feature to make comments or to converse with fellow attendees. Amanda Slider, the Associate Director of the Friends of Drake Well, will be monitoring the chat, and she will be adding resource links for you later in the program. Petroleum history has often been a space dominated by stories of great men. However, when historians investigate and interrogate historical resources, a diversity of perspectives emerges, including the voices of women. Talking Back, Women's Voices in the Oil Story is a three-part series that explores the work women performed in building the oil industry and Pennsylvania's oil region. Our presenter this evening is Melissa Mann. Melissa has over 18 years experience as a museum and public history professional. For the past 8 years, she has served as site administrator of Drake Well Museum and Park. Prior to joining PHMC, Melissa worked as the senior project manager for heritage development at the Oil Region Alliance, administrator of the Pennsylvania's Oil Region National Heritage Area, and as a photo archivist at the Albuquerque Museum of Art and History. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degrees in History and Spanish from Muskegon University and a Master of Arts in History from the University of New Mexico. Melissa is also a graduate of the American Association for State and Local Histories History Leadership Institute. This evening, Melissa will present Working Out of Bounds, Women's Labor in the Pennsylvania Early Oil Industry. And with that, I'll turn it over to Melissa.
All right, thanks, Sue. Thanks everybody for joining us this evening. It's nice to be with you all again. As Sue said, tonight we're going to talk about the experiences of women who defied convention and pursued work in Pennsylvania's oil industry between 1860 and 1885. So let me just get my slides going here. Sorry, there we go. All right, so as Sue also said, petroleum history has often been a space dominated by the stories of men. When I started studying oil history, the only women who had really been researched or written about were these two women. Ida Tarbell here on the left, investigative journalist who took on the Standard Oil Trust, and on the right, French Kate, who was an infamous madam of a number of oil boom towns. Now, I like to call this our saints and sinners dilemma in oil history. because Ida Tarbell and French Kate are really outliers in our story. And for a very long time, they've been, the sole focus when it comes to women's contributions. But this limited focus ignores, a whole sea of diverse women with diverse experiences who existed on the spectrum between the saint and the sinner. Um, and it's these thousands of women that also contributed to the burgeoning oil industry. And they did so in their own ways. The research that I've been doing over the last 4 years on women's labor history is an attempt to highlight the stories of more women and to expand the pantheon of women in oil history. So, to get us started tonight, before we get into the ladies, the women who were actually working in the industry, I want to talk a little bit generally about gender norms of period. Um, and I really love this image, and I'll tell you why in a second. This image is from Petroleum Center, one of the early boom towns in Pennsylvania. Um, but I want us to really have an understanding of what society at the time said that a woman could and couldn't do, and how she could and couldn't act. And during this period, the dominant gender ideology was that women and men were different, but that their natures were complementary. Now, women were thought to be morally superior to men, and men were thought to be women's intellectual superiors. Now, I just felt a collective eye roll from the women in the Zoom crowd. Don't worry, we're going to get to the good stuff. But women, this gender ideology was also, telling women that, women were gentle and emotional, ruled by their hearts. Men were ruled by their heads. They were, and so, the argument went because of the nature of women that, you know, the public arenas of business and trade and politics were too harsh for women's delicate sensibilities, and that these public areas were for men. Um, Women's gentle, upright, vulnerable nature was better suited for the protected sphere of the home, so that private sphere. Um, so this ideal, right, this gender ideology also creates a division of labor, right, or an idea of a division of labor, and that's where this photo really comes in, right? That a lot of people lived above their businesses, and so the woman, really in that kind of home sphere, and the men lined up in front of the business. So it really kind of epitomizes this gender ideology. So um, but this gender ideology is also being reinforced, right, by books of the period. But it's being reinforced in many different ways. But one of them is by this book that's here. It was published in 1860. It's called The Ladies' Book of Etiquette and Manual of Politeness. And this is 300 pages. This book, it's 26 chapters, and it covers things like conversation, how a woman should dress, behavior during travel, table etiquette, letter writing, good habits, your conduct in church, bridal etiquette, and comportment at events, from evening parties to balls, and whether or not the woman was a hostess or an attendee. Um, one of the main themes that of course, because it's called the Manual of Politeness, one of the main themes throughout this whole book is politeness. But what they're really trying to get across is that women should have a heartfelt kindness. That's what their politeness should be, right? It should be heartfelt kindness. It should not be hypocritical, self-serving kindness, right? That's what men do. And chapter 14 of this book really, it's called the conduct in the street, right? So conduct in the public sphere. And one of the quotes is, quote, "A lady's conduct is never so entirely at the mercy of critics, because never so public as when she is in the street," right? So really reinforcing this idea that women have to be careful in the public sphere because they're not prepared for it. They're not, it's not in their nature to be good at being in the public sphere. Um, but really so this is really kind of what society is telling women, right? That's the construct that women are working within during this period. Now, the problem with ideologies like this is that they set up a false binary, right? It's either house or street, public or private, and there's no in between. There's no middle ground, and these ideologies really don't take into account the multitude of variables that affect everyday life, and that reality is much more complex than the binary. So let's talk about the reality, right? We've got a great image here of the Sara Levy store. I believe this one's from the 1870s in Titusville. Now, the reality is that despite this gender ideology and its division of labor, um, women were absolutely working in the public sphere during this period in Pennsylvania and everywhere, really. They're working in informal domestic economy. So women like Edwin Drake, who drilled the well, his wife Laura, they're practicing the arts of household management for money, right? So they're doing what's considered quote unquote women's work, like laundry and sewing and cleaning and cooking for pay. Some of this work is still being done in the privacy of their own homes, right? Women are taking in sewing and seamstress jobs. Um, but a lot of this domestic work is also, like cooking and cleaning, is starting to shift into the public sphere, right? Women are doing this in the public sphere. They're also, so, you know, the records of the time period show, we've got women who are working as laundresses. They're hostesses and boarding house managers. They're chambermaids and cleaners. They're cooks and bakers, nurses, teachers. They're doing all of these types of jobs. They're also owning their own businesses, right, at this time. They're taking their skills and they're turning them into for-profit ventures. They're being entrepreneurial at this time. Their work is also, it's shifting, right? The domestic economy is really about kind of supplementing income, right? Supplementing a husband's income or a father's income. Whereas owning your own business is not necessarily about supplementing income. It is about just income. And it's, some of this work is still focused on again, this quote unquote women's work, right? But also it's fully ensconced in the public sphere. They're not doing it in private. The business directory for the oil region, which covers kind of Franklin to Titusville, also Tionesta, Tidiute, um, Pleasantville, a number of towns. This covered a wide region. So from 1869, the business directory shows that there were 23 women-owned businesses in the oil region. And they're anything from a dressmaker shop, millinery, boarding houses that are owned and operated by women. There was a female photographer, fancy goods stores, restaurants, clothing and furnishing goods stores, groceries, confectionaries, and Mrs. Mary Savage of Tionesta, who was an agent for the Singer Sewing Machine Company. So, there's absolutely no doubt that women were working in the public sphere at this time. But the question remains, right? This was the question that I had: were they working in the oil industry? And the answer is yes, they absolutely were. Some women stepped directly into what was considered the world of men by taking part in the oil business. And we're going to talk about three of these women tonight. And we're going to start with Sarah McClintock. Now, Sarah McClintock is best known as the adopted mother of John Washington Steele, who became the infamous coal oil Johnny. He is best known for his riches to rags story. There are plenty of books about coal oil Johnny and publications about him out there. Our friend Jennifer Burden of the Oil Region Alliance also did a talk last year for our lecture series on coal oil Johnny, which we have on our YouTube channel. So you can find more information there about him. But Sarah was his adopted mother, and she married Culbertson McClintock, who owned a 110-acre agricultural farm along Oil Creek which is just above present-day Roussville, Pennsylvania. And you can see here, there's a map. That red square is the border of the widow McClintock's farm. So Culbertson and Sarah adopted John and his sister Permelia when they were very young children. In his memoir, John described Sarah as, quote, a woman of good education for those days, and she possessed the practical and sensible idea that it was essential that everyone should be more or less versed in book learning, end quote. So education's important to her. They were also members of the Seceders Church, which is an offshoot of Presbyterian beliefs. And so they spent most of their Sundays in church. And John also says in his memoir, quote, Aunt Sally believed in walking the straight and narrow path, and she tried to persuade others to walk it too. So based on, kind of the reports and what Cole Johnny is saying, in his memoirs, she is a pro-education and she's a pious woman. So she can read and write. She can do the things that she needs to do to be able to be successful in business. Now, Culbertson dies in 1855. And he leaves the farm to his wife. His son is a minor at the time. So his estate is left to his wife. His will says, quote, I give and bequeath unto my wife Sarah all that certain tract of land on which I now reside on Oil Creek, adjoining the lands of John Rind and John McClintock, and other lands containing about 200 acres, with all the buildings belonging thereunto, to have and to hold during her lifetime, or so long as she remains my widow. After her marriage or decease, the tract of land then goes to her son, John Washington Steele. The will goes on to bequeath to Sarah all the stock, the household furniture, loose property, farming utensils. So she inherits everything that goes along with this farm. Now, and so this is 1855. The Drake Wall doesn't strike until 1859. So in those 4 years, she continues to run and operate the farm, and she's a farmer. Now, after the Drake Wall strikes in August of 1859, oil fever grips the region, right? And so people start rushing up and down the Oil Creek Valley, leasing land, drilling wells, and starting to develop this new industry. Landowners essentially would lease portions of their property to oil producers for a cash fee, as well as royalties on any discovered oil, right? Now, it's been argued that Sarah showed really great business acumen because by initially holding out when oil men approached her about leasing her land, and that resulted in better deals for her later when she did enter the business. Now, I wanted to find some proof of this. So, and I think I have, what the July of 1860 census tells us, I think proves that this is in fact true. Now, for almost a full year after the Drake strike, Sarah, who's 47 years old at the time, is still listed as a farmer, right? She's listed as a farmer, but her household includes her two children, and three farm laborers. Now, and her real estate is valued at $3,000, and her personal wealth is valued at about $997. So she hasn't struck it rich through oil yet. Now, at the same time, in the same census, John Rind, who owns the Rind farm, which borders her to the north, and you can see it, it's right under that red patch. That's John Rind's farm. And he's reporting in the same census that he has 7 oil miners living on his property, right? So the drilling at this time in July of 1860, when they're reporting for the census, is well underway. But it does look like Sarah held out and that she was perhaps assessing the situation before she dove in. Now, when she does lease her land to oil operators, it's for $400 or $500 per tract, and she's getting 1/8 royalty on all oil discovered. Now, many wells were put down on the widow McClintock farm, and several of them did extremely well. resulting in high profits for Sarah. And by the end of 1860, just to give you kind of a general overview of the valley, there were 74 producing wells along Oil Creek, and they were yielding about 1,200 barrels of oil daily. Now, between 1861 and 1865, oil producers started drilling deeper, and they started hitting oil in quantities that they had never imagined. And now these flowing wells increased daily production to 6,000 barrels a day, right? So the result of kind of drilling deeper and coming into the flowing wells is that there's more accumulated wealth and increased interest in putting down even more wells, right? So, according to the sources, Sarah was the frugal sort, and she put her money away and only really made modest purchases. So she wasn't a big spender, unlike her son. Um, Now, unfortunately, Sarah's time in the oil business was short-lived. She died on March 18th of 1864 from severe burns that were sustained when she accidentally poured crude oil on what she thought was a cold stove. Now, in her will, Sarah left $100 in cash to her cousin, Rachel McKnight, and $200 to Sarah Emily Moffett. The remainder of her estate, including cash, the property, and the all-important royalties, oil royalties, were left to her adopted son, John Washington Steele. Now, nobody knows exactly the amount of his inheritance. It's been reported as $24,500 to as much as $500,000. What we do know is that Sarah left John a very wealthy young man. He was in his early 20s at the time. In his 1865 book, Petroleum and Petroleum Wells, J.H.A. Bone describes Sarah McClintock's farm, saying, quote, "A large number of valuable wells are on this property, yielding a splendid revenue to the proprietor of the land, John W. Steele, who has just come of age." Right? So she did very well in the oil business. Now, was Sarah really defying convention? Was she only leasing her land to she was only leasing her land to oil operators. She wasn't drilling wells herself. So is she really defying convention? I would say yes. She's operating, she's making contracts with oil operators. But she's still really only on the periphery of the industry. So let's talk about somebody who wasn't on the periphery of the industry, who was right smack dab in the middle of it. All right, Mary Sands. Mary Sands was born around 1832 in Ireland. Now, 18-year-old Mary immigrates to the United States in November of 1850. She arrives in Philadelphia aboard the ship William Penn, and she travels from Ireland to England to the U.S. With Daniel Sands, who is age 24. Now, I haven't been able to determine whether he's her husband or another male relative, because later she claims to be a widow, but I have not been able to find any proof that she was ever married. And he really kind of falls out of the picture. So now Mary next pops up in Pithole City, which is pictured here. And Pithole is Pennsylvania's legendary oil boomtown. On January 7th of 1865, the Fraser well, which was a wildcat well, struck oil on the Holmden farm along Pithole Creek. And it was the first successful well outside the proven areas of the Oil Creek and Allegheny River valleys. And it launched a frenzy. Thousands of people flocked to this very isolated area in Venango County looking to make it rich. A couple of savvy businessmen, Thomas Duncan and George Prather, purchased the Holmden farm, and they laid out 500 lots for lease, and that was the founding of Pithole City. At its height, Pithole boasted about 15,000 residents, 57 hotels, 3 theaters, and an infamous red light district. And it had the 3rd busiest post office in the state. It was a place to be. It was big. But the boomtown, it declined almost as rapidly as it grew. And after about 500 days, its heyday was over, and its citizens were moving on to other booming areas. So Mary Sands first appears in the public record in Pithole in April of 1866, and it's not a great first impression for Mary. But she is arrested for selling liquor without a license. And she's separately charged with false pretense or obtaining property through false representation and with the intent to defraud. So she's looking at some serious charges. And then again, she next kind of shows up on the radar in August of 1866, and she's arrested again for selling liquor without a license. So it's safe to say that Mary is quite different than Sarah McClintock, right? They have different world experiences. Now, you can see here there's an ad for M.A. Sands Wholesale and Retail Grocers. This ad started running frequently after that second arrest in the paper, the Pithole Daily Record. And it, like I said, it runs pretty frequently. So Mary Sands owns this wholesale and retail grocers. It's at 58 Holmden Street, kind of in the main drag, one of the main drags at Pithole. Um, and the ad, which you may not be able to read all of, it says the cheapest and best place in Pithole to buy groceries. Very choice teas, coffee, spices, butter, cheese, beans, etc., kept on hand and sold at small profits. And in very small print at the bottom, it says wines and liquors of the finest brands for sale cheap. So, Mary's hasn't gotten out of the liquor business, but I'm assuming because she's advertising it. But by the time these ads start running, she has obtained her liquor license and is able to do so. Now, so she's running this. She's running a business. She's running this grocers, and very shortly after, on September 3rd of 1866, the Pithole Daily Record reports that 4 new wells are going down on the Holmden Farm bluff, and that 2 of those wells belong to Mrs. M.A. Sands, and that those 2 wells have been drilled down to 200 feet already. So lo and behold, not only is she a grocer, she has become an oil operator, and she's drilling wells at Pithole. Now, the next time Mary gets some reporting in the Pithole Daily Record is in November, and on the 6th, the paper reports that to have learned that Mrs. Sands' well on the Holmden Farm bluff has greatly improved. Right, the valves were changed in it on Sunday. End quote. So she's still working this well. This well is apparently successful, the one that she put down and was only at 200 feet. So it came in and struck oil. Now on November 11th, the paper reports that the Sands well has increased to 50 barrels of production per day, and that it is pumping admirably, and that the indications are that the well will produce up to 100 barrels a day. So this is a pretty good well. Especially, if this is November of 1866, and we're going to talk about this in a second, but Pithole's starting to decline at this point. In December, on the 27th, the well is reported, the second well, the Mrs. Sands well number 2, is now doing 50 barrels per day. So she's got two successful wells. And from its present rate, it looks like it's going to increase and be one of the largest producing wells on the bluff, according to the paper. So she's still doing pretty well, even in December of 66. And then at the end of the year, on December 31st, the paper reports that Mrs. Sands' well is yielding 80 barrels per day. Now, this was the highest production reported on the Holmden farm that day in the paper. So she's got, there were, all the wells were listed and what their production was. And she's got the highest producing well on the Holmden farm. Now, it's also reported that day that Mrs. Sands' new well, which had been stopped for a few days for repairs, had started up again and was at 15 barrels, and that production was increasing as it was pumped. So again, in December, in a time when Pithole's starting to decline, Mary Sands is on the rise. She's doing okay. The population by December of 1866 at Pithole, had dropped, right, from that 15,000 person high to about 2,000 people, and people were continuing to leave. And even though her wells appear to be doing okay, um, the bust of the Boomtown may have caused Mary some financial issues because, unfortunately, in August of 1867, she's in court again for failure to repay loans from George Davenport that were in excess of $2,300. Um, and then just a few months later, in November, she's in court again for failure to repay a loan to Robert Leakey. And that loan was in excess of $1,550. So she's definitely having some issues. But interestingly, she's not done with the oil industry, right? Her pit hole oil business wasn't a one off. She didn't just, it wasn't a kind of, her pit hole business wasn't the in the right time, in the right place at the right time kind of thing, right? She was in pit hole, everybody's putting down wells. Why don't I have some extra cash laying around? No, she's dedicated. She's in this business. Um, and we know that because the 1870 census finds Mary living in Pleasantville. She's listed as one of 48 people living in the McKinney house, which was owned by Thomas McKinney. And her occupation is listed as oil operator, right? And then in July, right? So just a month later, I'm sorry, July of 1871, she's reported as in the Titusville Herald, it's reported that they're reporting on the oil business and what's happening in Cranberry Township. And what we have is Mrs. Sands' well is causing considerable excitement and, quote, promises to be a large well, right? So she's in Cranberry putting down a well that looks like it's going to be successful in July of 1871. And then in November of 1871, the Oil City Derrick reports that Mrs. Sands is about to tube a new well on Sage Run. And there, quote, there is a strong prospect of it being equal to or better than the old one. Now, Sage Run is located about 2 miles south of Oil City, and it's just east of present-day Route 257. Now, multiple reports suggest that Mary obtained the 200 acres that she owned on Sage Run in a very creative manner. Now, so it's reported that while there were the McGrew brothers out of Pittsburgh were drilling their own successful well on Sage Run, that while they're doing that, Mary approaches the Philadelphians who own the property that she wants. And according to the reports, she, quote, enacted the role of a poor lone widow anxious to secure a patch of ground for pasture and to raise cabbage and garden truck, end quote. Now, apparently, the landowners were very anxious to help a woman in need. So they sold her this acreage at a very low price, and the price was $1,800. Now, Mary, so once she secures the land, she immediately turns around and sells a portion of the parcel for 10 grand. And then she sets about drilling her own well, and her first well on the Sage Run. And this well, as we'll see, is so successful that she's later able to ask $500,000 for it. So she's a very shrewd and creative business person. Now, also during this time, Mary spent $10,000. I don't know if it's a $10,000 she got for selling a parcel at Sage Run or not, but she spends $10,000 building the wooden sands block. And that building sat at the corner of Sycamore and Railroad Streets in Oil City. It's on the north side of Oil City. She leased space in this building to other businesses, including Standard Oil, the Oil City Oil Exchange, and a saloon. Because if we don't know anything by now, we know that Mary is into selling liquor. but she's not the she's not only, what's interesting about the fact that she builds the sands block is that she's not only making money through oil, right? She's taking that money and she's reinvesting it and she's compounding it, right? So she is diversifying her business. Um, and it's not just oil, but she's using the profits from oil to make more money in other areas. So again, really, really shrewd about it. Now, on February 7th of 1872, unfortunately, um, it's actually February 6th, in the very early hours of February 6th, a fire starts near the chimney of the National Hotel, which is a building adjacent to the Sands Block. And it spreads to the other buildings in the Sycamore and Railroad Block. And the National Hotel and the Taylor House and the Sands Block and the Allegheny Trust and Banking House were destroyed, while a number of other buildings were damaged by the fire. Now, Mary had a $5,000 insurance policy on the building, so she took a $5,000 hit. Plus, she took an additional $2,000 loss because she was not insured for the furniture and the furnishings of the building. But she's not to be deterred, right? So that happens in February. By May, the Oil City Derrick is reporting that the contractors working on the Sands Block are pushing the work rapidly, and that the locality will soon present, quote, a respectable appearance again, right? And not only is she rebuilding this building, she is not doing it in wood. She is now doing it in brick. So she has the money to be able to upgrade her building in 1872 as well. So she is succeeding. Now, in July, just a few months later, in July of 1872, the Oil City Derrick, it has a whole section on the sands well, and it's and I'll just read it out here for you. Uh, there has been considerable interest manifested over the prospect of a large well in the property owned by Mrs. Sands, about 2 miles south of this city. The well is about 975 feet deep, and it's just in the third sand. Several days ago, a vein of gas and oil was struck, and the oil was thrown over the top of the derrick, and the flow has continued at intervals up to the latest information we received, obliging the men to suspend operations for the present. The indications are favorable for a large well. Um, so she's succeeding again. This is her second well. August 2nd, 1872. The well recently struck by Mrs. Sands on her property is pumping about 18 barrels per day. The well is only a few feet in the sand, but drilling had to be abandoned owing to the immense flow of gas. The pumping is regular, but the yield is in 24 hours is about as stated above. Prospectors are already busy endeavoring to obtain leases, and the probability that a number of wells will be commenced at an early day. Old operators who had little faith in the productiveness of this territory for large wells are now confident that it may yet prove highly remunerative. So not only is she being successful, she is opening this it's a small field, but this small field by the Allegheny, off of Sage Run. So now she gets in a little bit of trouble, which is not surprising in a couple of months. So on Saturday, October 12th, 1872, Mary's next well comes in on Sage Run, and it comes in at 250 to 300 barrels a day. Great news for Mary, right? She's going to be bringing in a lot of money. However, this well really puts her on the wrong side of many producers in the region, because before she completed the well, she had signed on to what was called the 30-day movement. Now, this was an attempt at collective bargaining amongst the producers in the region. And by signing on, she had agreed to suspend pumping and drilling in the district, as they were in the district for 30 days. And this was in an effort to ensure fair compensation from oil buyers. So All these producers had signed on to do this, and that they were essentially on strike from production. Um, but she signed it, and then apparently she signed it just to get them out of her hair. And then she went about her business and kept on drilling. And then she struck oil, and she struck it big, and word got back to them, of course. And when they heard that her well was flowing, they were quite upset. One producer said that he couldn't believe a quote, daughter of Mother Eve would lie like that to men in the oil industry. Um, and then on October 15th of 1872, in a letter to the editor of the Oil City Derrick, the Producers Committee for the 7th District, they put a letter, but this is just part of their letter that I want to read to you. Quote, there is no statute to compel Mrs. Sands to act with a 30-day movement. She is accountable only to the law that should be written in the hearts of all, truth and honesty. We feel certain that this violation will not be charged to the producers of the district and believe it absurd that a single producer in the region will start up a well simply because one woman saw fit to throw a stone at the army that is struggling for organization and a fair compensation for their work. Right? So they're mad. they're they are upset with her. And honestly, she doesn't care. which I think is really great. It's unclear whether because they go out, they go back to the well site, they go to talk to her, they try to talk to her and say, you have to stop, producing. You need to put a cap on this. All this well that's flowing out, or all this oil that's flowing out of the well, we want you to burn it. We don't want you to sell it. It's unclear exactly what she does. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find that yet. But you know, people, who are reporting on this, are pretty clear, that, you know, in the paper, there's this quote that, Mrs. Sands is one of the lucky women of this section, and she's a little bit sharp about it, end quote. Right. So they really don't like the fact, they don't like the fact that she broke ranks, but it's especially onerous to them because she's a woman who broke ranks, right? It's not supposed to be in her nature to do this kind of thing. So they're pretty upset about it. Now, in November 21st, 1872, she's still working. They're still working on the sands block and upgrading it. They're adding kind of a larger front area to it, and asking for permission to expand the sidewalk if necessary. She's back in court in June of 1873. But this time it's not because she did anything wrong. She's making a complaint, that she paid a royalty, but never received the oil for it. In 1873 through 1875, the sands block is alive and well and hopping with people. There are dentists and jewelers, and you can see an ad here for the Humphrey. Humphrey the jeweler had a store, or had his shop in the Sands building. There was a cigar store. So she's still making money on her sideline as well. And then she kind of falls off the radar in the reporting. And the last that I've been able to find of her so far is from the Oil City Derrick in November of 1880. And it makes just a slight mention about the Bradford oil field, and the fact that, and it's talking about the Van Scory well, and talks about that's where Mrs. Sands of Oil City has also been prospecting, right? So she is moving with the oil boom still, right? She's not just sitting in Oil City. She's up in Bradford trying to prospect for oil. Now, Mary Sands was a shrewd businesswoman, as we've already talked about. But the question again, is she an outlier? Is she an aberration? Right? Is she just special? She's just Mary Sands. And what I am pleased to be able to tell you is that no, she's not an aberration. She's not an outlier. There were other women who tried their hand at oil production. And we are going to talk about one of them. And we're going to talk about Margaret D. Pease. Now, just to start, for nearly a decade, um, the Oil Creek Valley was the center of the world's oil industry, right? Back with Sarah McClintock. Now, however, the pursuit of ever more prosperity led oil producers to begin exploring outside the valley, right? So you've got Pithole, then you've got places like Sage Run, and they just keep moving out, and so the industry's focus starts shifting away from Oil Creek. It's first, to Clarion, Butler, and Armstrong counties, and then up to Bradford in McKean County. And Bradford becomes the world's first billion-dollar oil field. Bradford's first wells came in 1875, and by 1880, the region had 7,000 producing wells, averaging about 65,000 barrels of oil a day. At that time, Bradford was producing over 77% of the world's oil supply. It was a big, big field and a big deal. Now, the first we come across Margaret so Margaret emigrates to the United States in 1870 from Canada. She becomes a citizen, but the first we really catch her in the public record is from the unfortunate death of her husband on October 20th of 1879. Actually, he died on the 18th, and he was the proprietor of the Bradford House, which was a boarding house hotel on the main square in the city of Bradford. So the announcement on October 20th that he has passed away, and the quote about Mr. Pease is that he was well and favorably known in the city, and the hotel under his management had taken a fresh lease of life. Right. So not only was he a proprietor of a boarding house, that his boarding house was successful. Now, it has been said that oil operators, landowners, drillers made the Bradford House their headquarters, right? That it was a very popular place to do oil business, and that hundreds of big contracts were closed at the Bradford House. And you can see this is a picture of the Bradford House here on the left. Now, so Mr. Pease dies towards the end of October. November 1st, there's an ad in the paper, and this ad runs all month in November. It's a for sale ad, and Margaret is trying to sell the Bradford House. And she says, quote, "The house is doing a first-class business and everything connected with it is in first-class order. The undersigned desires to state that owing to the death of her husband and her inability to continue the business, those are the only reasons for her offering the property," right? And she's trying to get, she said special inducements offered for a cash sale, right? So she's trying to get cash quickly. This, like I said, this ad runs for the entire month of November. And then, but apparently she doesn't give up on it. Either it doesn't sell, and I don't know why it wouldn't sell, or she just decides, heck, I'm not going to give up on this, because the Bradford Era reports in February of 1880 that Margaret Pease is granted a liquor license for the Bradford House Tavern. So she's running the hotel. And then in June of 1880, 30-year-old Margaret is listed as the head of house at the Bradford House, and her occupation is listed as hotel keeper. And there are 53 people listed as residing in the residence. One of them is her 7-year-old adopted son, Charles. She has 10 staff that live in, and then there are 42 lodgers at the Bradford House. And 15 of those 42 lodgers list their occupation as oil producers, agents, torpedo agents, or drillers. And some of the other folks who are living there are lawyers and bookkeepers and insurance agents. So potentially all 42 of the people who are staying in their residence could be working for the industry, right? Working in the oil industry. So she's in the thick of it, even though she's not working in the industry. She's around it and hearing and listening and knows what's going on. Now, in July of 1880, the Bradford era lists that, or announces that the Bradford house has changed hands, right? So she has ended up selling it to Wallace Stone, who was another hotel owner. So that's in July. And then in October, she doesn't come back in to the record until October 7th of 1870. This is what the Bradford era has to say. Mrs. Pease, quote, Mrs. Pease is more than holding her own with the land grabbers at the front. The pleasant ways in which made her a popular landlady seem to come to her aid in securing real estate where the wildcat wells are going down. She has tied up 160 acres about the Marshburg well and has a good grip on 190 acres about the Van Scory well, where Mrs. Sands of Oil City has also been prospecting. The gentlemen will have to beware if the widow of the widow in their rush for new territory, as she is a diplomatist and is generally seen at the front while the chances are passing. Right. So all of a sudden, she has she dove in to the oil, to the oil industry, and she is buying up land and putting down wells. Now, unfortunately, I have not been able to figure out how successful Margaret Pease is in her efforts to enter the industry. She disappears from the PA record. um, and actually, I found her again, and I'm so looking forward to following up on more research on this. In 1885, so she's prospecting and buying up land in 1880 in Bradford, Pennsylvania, and putting down wells. But by 1885, she is listed with her adopted son Charles as living in Washington Territory, specifically in Seattle's Second Ward, and her occupation is listed as a milliner, right? So she's making hats. So I don't know if she is successful and moves to Washington Territory and opens up a hat shop because she thinks it would be fun and she has lots of money and can do it, or if she's actually a laborer working in a hat shop. Um, but she stays in Washington Territory. The 1890 census has her living with Charles again in the fourth ward of Seattle. The 1910 census, she's 61 years old. She owns her own home in Seattle. And under industry, she listed own money, quote, own money. So she has money, and she doesn't have to work. Um, and I found in August of 1911, she is on the passenger manifest for the ship Mongolia, and she arrives on August 6, 1911, in Honolulu, Hawaii, after embarking from Hong Kong. So she takes this trip overseas in her 60s. So it's hard to tell if there's no solid proof, but it seems like she may have money, which may have come from the oil industry and her work there. And like I said, I'm very much looking forward to digging deeper into Margaret's history. Here is a picture of Bradford in 1880. So this is what Bradford would have looked like when Margaret was prospecting. And I'm just going to wrap up by talking to you a little bit about future directions for this research. This is work that's ongoing. I'm passionate about it. It's fun, and I'm looking forward to finding, like I said, more information on Mary Sands and Margaret Pease. I think it's out there. I think it exists. It's finding it. There are commonalities between Sarah McClintock, Mary Sands, Margaret Pease. It seems like they were all widows. Um, so they were kind of the head of their family. They were all kind of the head of their business when they started their business. They weren't working for somebody. They were in charge of the business. And not every woman had that opportunity in the oil region, right? So there are plenty of women who were working in and around the early oil industry that weren't in this same position that these three women were. And I'm very much looking forward to trying to uncover those stories, right? So I'm excited about it. Bottom line, despite convention, despite what society was telling them, these women, Sarah, Mary, Margaret, they demonstrate that women were working successfully in Pennsylvania's early oil industry. Um, and like I said, I'm looking forward to finding out more about their stories. So thank you so much. I am happy to take any questions. And before we get questions, I'll just point out this picture. I love it. Sue found it in our collection, and we love it because in the circle, in work clothes, that's a woman, right, on the rig. Most photos of women at rigs are kind of portraiture photos, right, or family photos where they're dressed nicely and it's an occasion. This woman is in work clothes. It appears that she is there to work. So like I said, I'm looking forward to uncovering her story.
I just wish we knew who that woman was.
I know, me too.
I mean, those walking beams were not low to the ground. I'm going to start off the questions.
Sure.
I wonder what the likelihood is that the Mary Sands Sage Run story about her being the widow and playing on the sympathies of these Philadelphia owners.
Right.
I wonder if that was really true, or was it a fable, like the one about William Story's wife selling off the Story farm for a silk dress.
Right.
Which
it's hard to say, right?
Because has proved that it's totally
right,
false.
Right. Yeah. And those are and I think that's what's fun, right? I always try to preface this, when I give talks about this research, it's still such a work in progress. Finding more information every day, and through talking to other historians who are doing research, and finding things that say, oh no, what you thought is not exactly right. And I think this is a valid question, a very valid question, because the people reporting this story are all men. And so it's did they just not like to be shown up? That the only reason that she could have gotten such a great price on those 200 acres is because she tricked somebody, right? Not because she was a good businesswoman, not because she was convincing in another way. So yeah, I think I don't know how we prove that. But it's something that it's kind of on the checklist, right? you know always with those questions, always analyzing the data, right, and saying, oh, is this possible that this is just bad blood because they don't like being shown up?
And by a woman.
By
really?
A woman. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know where Mary Sands lived during her Oil City Cranberry Township days?
I do not know where she lived. The records are somewhat incomplete. She shows up in that 1870 census, and then she doesn't show up in any other censuses. So there is another Mary Sands that's listed in, I believe it's either the 1880 or the 1890 census, as living in Cranberry, but it's a different woman. She does not have the same background as this Mary Sands. She's from somewhere else. It just doesn't line up.
And then I found one that was active in the Titusville Women's Club, which definitely wasn't her.
Yeah, unfortunately, Mary Sands is a popular name, which also makes the pinpointing the exact Mary Sands in the historical record that I'm looking for a little difficult.
Did Mary Sands ever go to jail or in some way punished for
Not that I know of. I do believe she had to pay some fines, but she did not go to jail that I know of. That doesn't mean that I have found all of her infractions or her quote unquote infractions. So I don't know. She may have at some point, but not that I have found.
And any possibility that Sands and Pease would have crossed paths?
Absolutely. I think so. I was looking hard when they crossed paths in the newspaper. I was starting to look hard to see if, because who's to say that Mary Sands didn't stay at the Bradford house and talk to Margaret Pease and talk her into doing, going into the business herself. I mean, that would be fantastic. However, there's no record to, there's no records to prove that. We may find it someday, but I haven't been able to get up to Bradford to do a very in-depth search of the historical records in the Bradford Landmark Society. So
Yeah, and a lot of this is courthouse digging.
right, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then that's the thing with doing women's history, right? Or doing women's history and any other people of difference, right? Anybody who's not a white man, it's harder to find them in the public record. So you really have to dig, right? So, I've gone through hundreds of newspapers just looking. Thank God they're all digitized now, and that you can put in the words you're looking for, and it reads. I can't imagine doing this, 20 years ago, 25 years ago would have been much more difficult, and it's
Yeah.
difficult now.
Were there ways for women to obtain seed money, start a business, other than via widowhood or inherited wealth? Or did they need the permission that marriage or widowhood provided for them to be alone in the public sphere?
I think that widowhood certainly helps them, right, be in the public sphere because they were married. They're just not married anymore, right? So they don't have a choice in the matter. I think at the time it would have been very difficult for a single woman who wasn't a widow to get the seed money, to get a loan from the bank. Now, whether or not they would have been able to work in the industry in different way, like, work with companies, right, that weren't banks, I don't know. Not that I've seen in the record, but I mean, it was hard for a woman to get a loan 60 years ago, let alone over 160 years ago.
How do you think these stories compare to women trying to enter other energy industries today?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think that this has been something that I've been thinking about, kind of the relevance of this kind of work. And I think it's one of the things that I was thinking about the other day was that doing this work is extremely important, especially when, getting more information, not just on women who are working, drilling wells and in oil production, but that, because at this time, the industry is new, right? It's brand new. It never, the industry never existed before. And so the building of community and industry are so intertwined at this time. And even within, oil boom towns and things like that, that women who are working as chambermaids or laundresses or, they're helping the industry. They're helping to build the industry because they're creating the towns and they're doing the work that these people need in order to be able to do the work in this area. And I was making connections between that and, just a few years ago, the Marcellus shale boom, right? So in northeastern Pennsylvania or in southwestern Pennsylvania, when these drilling companies were coming in from all over the country and putting down these really deep gas wells, and they were taking over towns, right? Their populations were booming just like they were in the 1860s. They're putting up new hotels, brand new hotels just to house oil field workers, right? And who's running those hotels, those new hotels, right? Mostly, who's cleaning them? You know, Mostly women. And I think being able to make the connection between what is happening in the 1860s and women's work and looking at what happens in energy booms today is very relevant because I think that there are a number of connections there.
Have you ever seen an etiquette or manners guide for men?
No. I'm trying to think. I mean, all the ones that I've seen are for women. I'm trying to think if I've ever seen one for a man.
I have seen one that was what young Christian men should know
Yeah,
about women.
there's that. I mean,
But it
maybe.
wasn't
Yeah.
wasn't necessarily etiquette.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't, not in the same way that this is written.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I never have.
Right.
One of the museum's strategic goals is to include more perspectives in our telling of the oil story. In the Talking Back series, we're focusing on women's perspectives, but we know that women aren't a homogenous group and that some women experiences still aren't included. What women are missing from the history you explored this evening, and how do we include those perspectives?
Well, and I think, this is the common question that we've been asking after every, at all three of our lectures. And, some of it's the same, right? These are folks, history, the nature of history, is that, it's written and it's written by people who are in power, right? It's written by dominant folks in society, and that includes collections, right? Things that are saved, things that are kept. Um, it's the what the dominant folks in society think is important is what gets collected. So it's difficult sometimes to find these women in the record, but we know, and Sue and I have had these conversations, many times. We know that there were African American women at Pithole. We know that there were African Americans living in Titusville, in the 1860s through the 1890s. We know that they were there, but their records weren't kept, at least weren't kept in Titusville. And so it's harder to find them in the record. They were working. I think one of the areas that I'm most interested in kind of getting into, right, is, we talked about this question of, you know, the widows, and that they have kind of a special status, right? I want to get to the women who don't have that special status. One of the great things about doing, this kind of work is that when you talk to other historians, um, they about your research, they bring you things when they find them. And one of the greatest things that I've gotten in a while, actually, Sue brought me, from our collection, and it was a letter, from Mrs. C.A. Campbell, to the John L. McKinney Company, and it's in our McKinney collection. And it's just such a great letter. I'll just read just a tiny bit of it to you. So essentially what has happened is, Joseph Levy has shown up at her house, and he was sent by the company to pump the wells and take care of the lease. And she says, quote, "Now I want to tell you that I shan't pay you nor no one else to take care of my quarter, for I intend to take care of it for myself. Um, for I live here on this lease. My quarter is an undivided interest, so you see, no one can control it." And she goes on to say that, nobody can compel her to sell it. And she talks about, the fact that her husband has left her to go out west to try to find money. Um, and she says, "I still keep the quarter to live on. I have a large family. I have taken care of this lease, uh, for 3 years by myself. If you," she says, "I wish you would let me still take care of it. I will do it cheaper, than anyone else if you will give me $15 a month and pay for the extras." Right. So this is a woman who has no privilege, right? She owns an interest. She owns a quarter interest in this lease, but she is not in a privileged position. She's working for somebody else is in control. And so these are the kind of women who are working on leases and doing, the labor of the oil industry, that, they exist. And these are some of the folks that I'm interested in, starting to uncover.
Yeah, and there's so much more in our collection that we still need to cover.
Absolutely,
The
absolutely.
image that you showed at the very first with
Hmm.
the sign of the talk, the tea party at Tar Farm.
Right, right,
Is that a woman of color on the far
right,
side?
right,
And some of those women to me look like they could be Native American, but were they members of the Seneca Nation or
right, right. There's
Delawares that never left?
right. We know that they were here. These women were here We just want, it's just getting the time and into the records and really getting in and digging, and finding them. But
And
it's
hoping that
so exciting. It's
descendants
so much fun when you do.
and hoping that descendants contact us with information.
Absolutely.
Share the family stories. And
Absolutely.
speaking of sharing, Hillary has shared that naval officers' etiquette manuals and other military branches have etiquette manuals for men, obviously.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So thanks, Hillary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does anybody else have any questions? Well, we want to thank you all for joining us this evening. The museum will host more virtual programming in the coming months, so be sure to watch our website, and to get to our Facebook channel, go to Facebook and you can click on channels and search for Drake Well Museum and Park, and that way find our Facebook channel. And we also have a regular Facebook page with events as well. So keep checking those for more information. And now that some of us are starting back to the Drake Well, you can even call us by phone or email us through the websites. So thank you all very much for coming tonight.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming.